Good afternoon, everybody. As was mentioned, my name's Brent. Slight difference in my bio. I've recently moved to the United Kingdom. I was in Canada, but I've moved this past spring, and I'm quite enjoying it over here. So why is Microsoft 365 backup critical? Well, as was mentioned in sort of the introduction, one of the things that a lot of organizations struggle with right now is data retention and data retention policies and how we can keep an organization compliant with different types of laws, but also keep the company secure enough in the amount of data that they have that they can go back in a period of time and restore from information that may have been deleted. One of the great ways of doing this in the past has been for external storage for things like tape backups and those sorts of things. But tape backups are hard to maintain. They're expensive because, of course, the tapes are expensive. And it's a lot of work to get the data back. You really have to go through a process to be able to get information back if somebody deletes it. And more times than not, unless it's an absolutely critical thing that somebody has accidentally deleted or something of that nature, chances are you never really go back and use it anyways. In past experience that I've had in several different organizations, one of the things that they do really well is they back everything up, but they don't restore it after the fact, or they don't know how to get it back. And so we're going to take a look at some of those sorts of things. So we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the concepts behind information protection from a Microsoft point of view, using some of the Microsoft tools that are available. We're going to take a look at data retention, the ability to do recovery of that data, and also some prevention of potential data loss and corruption as well. So the first thing we need to know is sort of what your data looks like. Okay, so now this doesn't necessarily mean that it's just the data that's on premise. It could also include any data that you have in the cloud, but you need to know what the data looks like. And so there are four different parts to the Microsoft information protection process or procedures that are available. First of all, you need to know what the data is, right? A lot of organizations collect data. They collect a lot of data. Everything you collect goes someplace, somewhere, and is used by somebody at some point in time. But do you really know what's there? So having all of that data is really great. If you don't use it, it's kind of useless to you. So you need to know what that data is, how you're going to access it, whether it's a completely on-premise piece of information or it's something that could exist in the cloud or in a combination of the two. So knowing that is important. How do we protect it? Right now, we might just be doing standard nightly backups using, if it's a SQL server, we might be using a SQL server job to do the backup, but we don't do anything outside of that. So we need to understand how we're protecting the data and what processes we're going to use to identify the types of data that need to be protected. How am I preventing loss, right? Am I just using security policies in Active Directory or in an application to prevent people from being able to delete information or be able to share information that's sensitive to my organization? Or am I also using extended long-term backups? Am I using third-party organizations to store off-site storage for extended backups, things like Iron Mountain and other organizations like that do long-term storage? Or am I going to be storing it into my own cloud provider, whether it's a Microsoft or any of the other providers that are available for cloud storage? So we need to know what type of prevention we're going to use. And then lastly, we need to govern it, right? This is where most organizations seem to fall down, is knowing how they're going to govern the data that they have. How long do they keep it? What's the retention policy? How do I store it? More importantly, how do I remain compliant, right? Those four things will tell you how you're going to manage all of your data. And regardless of how you're storing it currently, being able to look at different tools that will allow you to store the data in a more comprehensive and effective way. So obviously, Microsoft Azure Cloud Storage has a great methodology for being able to store data, whether that is raw data as a standard file system, or it could be using things like SQL Server storage or Azure SQL. Could be using things like Exchange Online and those sorts of tools as well. So we're going to take a look here over the next slide or two about how we can store data and maintain it so that it's retrievable and actually usable in certain situations when things might go completely sideways, and and we need to be able to recover back from where we were. So first and foremost is understanding data retention. Okay, so data retention is a really funny thing because depending upon what your organization does will determine how the data is retained. As an example, if you're a bank, chances are some other financial institution, chances are there is going to be some very strict government regulations that specify how long you must maintain information. So as an example, you may have to maintain loan records for 10 or 12 years. You may have to maintain financial transactions for up to 20 years. It just depends on what your government regulation specifies for your particular industry. And so there are a number of different retention policies and configurations that exist within the Microsoft Cloud that can help you work with these different types of organizations and industries and government requirements and industry requirements and so forth. So when we get into things like legal holds on emails, as an example, there are specific retention policies that specify how long messages will be held, where they're going to be located, how they're going to be accessed, all of those sorts of things. And so we need to first of all, as part of the previous slide, where we're understanding and knowing our data, we can then label that data to determine what needs to be stored for extended period of time, which has an important retention policy associated to it, and other data that is not initially designed to be stored for a long time. So to give you an example, organizations may decide for legal purposes, whether it's because they're firing people or because they end up in a lot of legal cases in court and that sort of stuff, that they're going to maintain email transmissions in people's mailboxes for an extended period of time. So one of the policies that can be enabled in Exchange Online is litigation hold. Litigation hold will basically say, even if a person goes and deletes the entire contents of their mailbox from Outlook, there is a copy of that mail kept in a back database in Exchange Online for you to be able to go and retrieve and be able to review at any point in time in the future. So that's an example of one of the ways that we can look at the data that we have. We can understand how the data that we have is useful, and then maintain that data in a system where we can extend the amount of time that we can retrieve that information. Another piece of data retention, of course, is like being able to get the data back. And when we talk about recovery here in a minute, we're going to talk about different ways that we can use the cloud-based system to retrieve that information back in the least amount of effort that's possible. The first thing, though, is that we need to do is we need to make sure that that we have data retention policies in place. Okay. And so when we're talking about this, we're going to talk about something called data immutability. So data immutability is the capability of doing in-place retention. So much like the mailboxes that we're using for Exchange, where we were keeping the mail in the Exchange database, but a separate copy of it from what the user would actually execute, that's an example of having in-place retention available. But it also gives us the capability of doing data archiving. So if we have a tool, let's say SQL Server, that we're running, and we decide that we want to do long-term storage of SQL backups, let's say longer than 7 days, because most systems have enough storage space in them to cover 7 days worth of backups, we would turn on something for data archiving. And to do data archiving, we can use Azure SQL in the cloud connected through M365 to be able to copy that data up into the cloud and use it for long-term storage. Because when you're copying data into a cloud, into your Azure subscription, you don't pay any prices for the data going into the subscription. You're only paying for the data to come out. So for long-term storage, you're really saving yourself a lot of money because you don't have to have storage in on-prem. And you're saving yourself a lot of effort because the jobs will automatically execute that storage to the cloud, right? And so you have that long-term data archiving process where if 6 months down the road, you find that there's a piece of information that I need in a specific database or an entire database was deleted, I can go to that location in the cloud. I can find that particular backup for that particular database, and I can retrieve that and restore that. And the only cost that I would have to incur would be the data transmission cost to get that database copied back down. But it saves you the time, it saves you the effort, and it saves you the money because you don't have to have the physical equipment. You don't have to have as much administrative overhead, and you don't have to worry about what happens to that information in the cloud. So one of the advantages of using the Microsoft storage locations is that Microsoft themselves has this long-term data archiving and data immutability in place. So as an example, if you were to set up your data storage in the Western United States, in US West, there would be copies of that data not only located in that particular data center, but whatever its parent or its sister data center would be, whether it's US East or Canada West or wherever it happens to be, a replica copy of that information will be stored at that location. So what happens is that if for whatever reason US West goes out, the information will still be available in another data center that you can be able to get access to. Okay, so data recovery. If we're putting the data somewhere, anywhere, other than, let's say, in a standard backup in on-prem or something of that nature, we need to be able to get that information back. So as I was saying, if we're storing the information into the cloud, we don't have to go through the same scenarios in terms of writing to tape, taking the tape off site, putting the tape in some place like Iron Mountain or some other company that does extended storage, and then having to deliver and drop off tapes on a weekly basis and yada, 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 right? There's all of that stuff that goes with it, and it's a royal pain in the butt. Being able to store the data in the cloud where you have direct access to it and you own it makes it so much easier. See, a lot of organizations don't realize or have this misperception that, well, I'm storing the data on the Microsoft site, or I'm storing the data on some other organization's site. They're going to be able to go in and take a look at what my data is. And the actual answer to that is no, they can't. Microsoft will never, ever go in and look at what data you have stored in your extended storage. That being said, if the US government or the Canadian government or the British government decided they want to take a look at it, well, they can get a court order and they can take a look at it. But generally speaking, the hosting company that will be hosting the infrastructure where your data will be stored will never actually go in and take a look at your data. Even if for whatever reason you lose something or something else, there's absolutely no way that Microsoft can go in and take a look at your data. So organizations that know that can take advantage of the storage that is provided. But as part of that storage, we get three things out of it that really help us the most. First of all, is data corruption, right? People screw stuff up all the time. I screw stuff up all the time. I remember back in the old days. Now I'm old. I'm 50. Well, older. I should be careful. When it was Windows 3.1, and I was in university and I was doing programming, and I went to delete a folder, and I went delete C:\\, and I went enter at the DOS command. And as soon as I hit enter, my brain went, what are you doing? And by that point, it was too late. I literally lost everything. I had to reinstall Windows. I had to luckily I had a bunch of storage on floppy disks, good old floppy disks, and I could get that information back. But I had to go through the process of reinstalling Windows and resetting my screen, and resetting my displays, and putting my toaster screensaver back on and all that other sort of stuff. And it took me forever, right? It took me an entire day. I've wasted an entire day rebuilding my computer, right? Now, if I would have had sensitive data on there, then I would have lost it. It never would have come back. By storing the information in the cloud, I have greater retention capabilities because the data, if the data is corrupted on my local environment, I can retrieve a copy of it back from the cloud with very little effort and be able to get that information back. So I can replicate file servers, I can replicate databases, I can replicate all sorts of information and store that data into the cloud. The second one is malware and ransomware protection. Every day, and I mean multiple times a day, you're reading about organizations that are getting caught with ransomware or getting caught with, some sort of bug or virus or whatever, and they can't unlock their data because some cyber criminal has encrypted it, and you have to pay X thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to get the encryption key or the decryption key to be able to get your data back. And even to be honest, if you pay the ransom, there's no guarantee that A, you're actually going to get the decryption key, and B, that they won't hit you a second time, right? Now, there's all sorts of reasons why that happens: user education, poor security, lax patching, all sorts of different reasons why it happens. The point is that it happens. If I have copies of that information in the cloud and stored in the Microsoft framework in the cloud, I can retrieve that information, and I don't necessarily have to pay for ransomware retrieval and that sort of thing. I have the capability of going in and getting my systems back. The companies that don't take advantage of that are the ones that are being hit hardest, right? And so when you look at the companies like the I think it was JDS, the meat packing company that got hacked, and all these other companies, hospitals that are being attacked. The borough that I live in, London, is called Hackney, which is really ironic because last October they were hacked, and they still haven't got their systems up and running because they can't log into them. Well, the systems are still running, but they can't log into them to make changes. So, for instance, billing rates on property taxes can't be changed. They can't. In the UK, when you rent an apartment, you pay what's called council tax. Well, they can't assign the council tax to other people because they can't log into their system to fix it. If they had this cloud-based computing capability, or at least storage capability, they could recover from that ransomware attack and go in and say, you know what? Not only would I have my data in another place, I might even be able to say, I've got my virtual machines in a different location. Haha, fooled you. We're just going to shut all this infrastructure off, and we're going to run off this one, and we're going to work quite well. So having that secondary storage or that second location of putting information is vital to making sure that your organization can stay up and running. And the third one is exchange data resiliency. So, there are all sorts of tools in the Microsoft suite that run in the cloud. There's SharePoint Online, there's Dynamics 365, CE, and finance and operations, and all sorts of other tools. But the one that probably is used by 95% of organizations out there is Exchange. And even though Microsoft has had a few issues with Exchange because of one of their vendors recently, still the system itself is rather secure and does do a good job in making sure that your data is there. Right now, when you have a situation where you have an online server, a server in your data center, and you don't have duplicate copies of it, or you don't have valid backups of it, and you lose a hard drive, you could lose, in theory, all of your email. By using Exchange Online, or at least a hybrid of Exchange Online, you have that extra layer of security and safety that if your on-premise system gets corrupted, or you lose a drive, or you lose data or whatever, that the duplicate copy that exists in the cloud will be able to basically pick up from where you left off and continue. And as far as the users are concerned, they wouldn't know any different, right? So allowing this capability and being able to retrieve that information is probably the most vital thing. And of any piece of information or of any system that exists in any organization, email is probably 1 or 1A behind Active Directory. So obviously we want to make sure that we prevent data loss, right? And in the previous screen, we talked about how we can, preserve data and whatnot, but we need to make sure that we can prevent data loss. So data loss prevention is done through a number of different things. It's not only done through the actual storage of information into the cloud, but it's also based upon the policies that you have for data retention. So there are a number of different types of configurations that you can use through the Microsoft system, through M365. You could set it up as a cloud-only process. You could set it up as a hybrid-only process, or a hybrid process rather. You could set it up as a on-prem only with duplicate copies stored in the cloud, so they're not live, right? In a hybrid scenario, as an example, you would have an on-premise Exchange server and a cloud-based Exchange server, whether it's running Exchange Online or in an Azure VM. So you'd have that sort of hybrid scenario. Or you might just say, you know what, I'm going to put all of my backups into the cloud. And so as you get more and more information and more data, you will be able to put that information in there and know that it's secure. Again, that's the big key, is knowing that once the data is in the cloud, it'll be there for as long as you pay your bill, quite frankly. And as long as the systems are up and running, you'll be able to access all of that information regardless of where that particular information is located. And the policies will help you make sure that your organization is going to be able to come back from all sorts of different things, whether it's a litigation process or a security breach or something that will make you need to get to that data because it's vital and important. Right? In the United States, there's also some other policies that apply to it. It's not just data retention that you come up with. If you're being traded on the New York Stock Exchange or any stock exchange for that matter, there's this little thing called Sarbanes-Oxley, which has very specific requirements that you maintain. So as an example, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requires you retain certain types of content for at least 7 years, right? So if you don't have that information and you, for whatever reason, have an SEC infraction and you have to go to court and you can't produce that information, you will be sanctioned by the court. And the sanctions probably won't be very pretty. So the policies that you also have to follow are ones that are industry standard or government mandated. And so the retention that we set up with the policies will help us to determine the length of time, the amount of time, and where that data is being stored. There is also data lifecycle, right? So data sometimes will be static in the sense that data will never change. Once it's created, once it's written the first time, it'll never change. That's very rare. It's very rare that a piece of information or a piece of data that you're storing, whether it's a database record or it's a Word document or it's something you put in SharePoint or it's a video file, very rare that those documents or those types of files will never change. And so there's always going to be modifications. Part of your policy and prevention is being able to keep instances of that information, right? So one of the things, as an example with SharePoint, is you have versioning, right? Versioning of a document is fantastic because it allows you to say, I'm going to go back 4 versions of this document and I'm going to be able to see what the contents was. And if you're using things like Office Online or any of the other M365 applications, you have, as an example in Microsoft Word, the ability to go back and see the previous versions of that file up to X number of documents. Let's say it's up to 6, right? And so that life cycle of the document can happen and it can occur, but it does give us the ability to go back in time and say, oh, hey, you know what? This is the way it should be and this is incorrect. So we're going to modify it to be back to the old version. Or I can even as simple as delete the current version and restore a previous one through my versioning. So there is a number of different ways that that using document life cycles and system life cycles will make it a lot easier to prevent that data loss from occurring in the first place. And the last one is deployment. And when I talk about deployment, I'm talking about, again, where is the data living, right? And I keep repeating about, where is the data living, where is the data living? But it's very important to know that. Again, all of your data, if your data lives on-premise and you're relying on on-premise systems and on-premise users, there is a risk that things could go sideways, right? And so how you've deployed your backup strategy, how you've deployed your long-term storage strategies is very important to the efficiency of the organization, okay? If you start implementing cloud backups and cloud storage for data retention, this will obviously help in the prevention side of things, so that you don't have a scenario where you're going to run into a problem getting the data back. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, so as was mentioned in the introduction, I used to live in Calgary, Canada, and we had a massive flood. This was in 2013, I believe it was, or 14, something like that, and 13. And what happened is that it was the 100-year flood, and there was water everywhere. And there's a cable company in town that is the hoster for most of the provincial government's data centers. And they had duplicate systems. So they had it in their primary center, and then they had a backup in a secondary center. The problem is that the secondary data center was in the same flood zone as the primary data center. So guess what happened? When the primary system went down because the power went out, and they flipped over to the secondary system, an hour later, literally 1 hour after they flipped it over, it lost power too because it was in the flood zone. So there was bad planning, right? And they were relying entirely on on-premise backups and on-premise data retention. And it took them quite a long time to get the system back up and running. So they literally had to take secondary backups of the systems, move them to a dry location where they could actually power them up, and then be able to get the system back up and running. It took them 6 weeks to do that, which if they were using a cloud-based system, even if it was just certain servers that were running in the cloud, they could have gotten back up in minutes rather than days or weeks or months. And having the system deployed in such a way that it takes advantage of those cloud configurations will save your life a lot, and your organization will be able to be that much stronger. Okay, so that's the short presentation. There's a ton of things that most of you are probably thinking right now in terms of how is my organization set up? Am I going to be, am I ready for the risk? Am I ready for, any type of disasters? And my parting point to you will be this: as long as there are people out there who want to do harm to business because they're criminals, or they're cyber criminals, or they're terrorists, or they're just a bunch of meandering teenagers that are trying to break into things, or they're inadvertent actions that are completed by staff members, you do need to make sure that you have sufficient systems in place to mitigate, prevent, and recover from those types of scenarios, whether it's using cloud-only based infrastructure or cloud in combination with on-prem infrastructure. Those types of configurations and setups in the long run will not only save your organization effort, but it'll save you the time that you would be down, but most importantly, it will save you money, because when you're not working, you're not making money. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brent, for that truly informative webinar. And we want to remind our attendees, keep those questions coming in. We will get to them in just a few moments. But first, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Chitra Kannan, who is our product manager, and she will be telling you about some of our amazing promotions and webinar related stuff. So Chitra, let me pass this over to you now.
Got it. Thank you so much, Tracy. So for people who have joined us today, I hope you had a wonderful moment enjoying this session that was done by Brent. Going forward, I just thought I'll share a couple of things that we have on offer for you. So logging on to netcomlearning.com, you'll be able to go on to our Microsoft offerings. Courses that are related towards this training that you'll have had today would be the Microsoft 365 Fundamentals, which is MS 9001. Another course that would be suggested here would be the MS 500, which is more towards the security administration. That said, we have 4 courses that we are suggesting. All these 4 courses are listed in the handouts that's been given to you. One option that you can do is register to them individually. The other option is actually going on to Microsoft, go into the solutions, you have the NetCom Unlimited, click on it. Nearly all these courses that are listed here is part of the NetCom Unlimited subscription. It's available to everybody as long as you have a corporate ID. That's the only prerequisite you have. Go ahead, sign up. You're only paying up for one course, but you can access all 4 of these trainings absolutely at that cost alone. This is a 12-month subscription and you have access to it. The second aspect is if you're keen on attending more of these webinars, click on resources, go on to webinars. You will have the listing of complete webinars from today for the next 3 months at least. Go through, we have a wide offering mentioned here. We have quite a few masterclasses schedules. Everything from cloud, security, business applications is available for you to choose from. Register to whichever is of interest to you. If there's at any point of time you just want some information, you can always email us. The information on which ID you can email is already there in the handout. Anything else, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much. And Tracy, it's back to you.
Thank you, Chitra. We hope that you found today's webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.